can't join, and I don't know if you'll be able to see the hands if you've got slides up, but I'll keep an eye and let you know. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it off to you.
Sounds good. I'm going to go ahead and just quickly pull up. Can everybody see my screen right now?
As we're loading. There it is.
Excellent. So everybody can see the quick introduction screen here. So my name is Steve Stesny. I am the data practice lead for PredictiveUX. And just a brief note about my background and sort of why I'm here. I come from the business side of things. For years, I've worked in marketing and publishing, got heavily into product management, and more recently have gotten into graph projects, building out graph platforms, building out knowledge graphs, building out graph applications. I've also done a lot of work with data platforms. I've worked in the marketing, the publishing, and the public affairs realm. So over the last, in particular, probably since about 2015, most of the product management work that I've been doing has been in the graph space. I've been around in sort of the data world for about 20 years, and really focusing on specifically of late the graph world. Currently, in my role at PredictiveUX, I'm the data practice lead, and we do a lot of work in the graph space, working with clients to really help them understand what their challenges are from a business perspective and how graph could potentially solve them. And we work with sort of two general types of clients. Types of clients are people who have a knowledge graph, a graph database, and are like, what do I do with it, right? It's been sitting on my budget now for 6 months, and my boss is getting a little feisty with me about the costs. So what do we do with it? That's number one. The other one is people who are just interested in it, right? They have different data sources and they're trying to figure it out. So we really work with them to give them roadmaps, to really try to give them the strategies to move forward. But what I really want to get into, and what I talked to Alan before about, was sort of some of the challenges and sort of lessons learned about implementing graphs and knowledge graphs a little bit as well too, I've gained over the last 6 years or so in this space. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in. Just go ahead and ask away, and I'll get to it. So I came to this space in 2015, but I'm going to start briefly before that. I worked for a company called Sage Publications, and they had a division called CQ Press. And CQ Press is a really interesting organization because for 30 or 40 years before that, they published directories, and they published directories of people who worked in the federal government. They put directories of people who worked on the Hill here in Washington, D.C. for the U.S. Congress. And then they also published directories for the judicial branch as well, too. So they went together and said, hey, look, the directory business is a little tough, so we want to pull all that information together. So they digitized 20 years of their directories, all 3 versions, so 60 versions basically of these, and they went ahead and they OCR'd them. They pulled out the data, the names, everybody, and put them in a large database. And then from there, which is cool enough, which is pretty cool because you get these really cool work histories of individuals. But then from there, they wanted to add more data to it. So in particular, there was lobbying data. There was also campaign donation data as well, too. That, if you're working in these spaces, or you work on the Hill and you're a lobbyist and all of these things, they sort of start to all tie together. And so as I was working on this project and bringing it to market, it was a really fascinating project because I got to learn all about disambiguation, how that happens, and really, how to, build the systems to be able to support that. But also, in a way, it really reflected where sort of the graph world is today. It was an expert finder. So you can type in a name, you can get back information. We had a little visual built in Java, which is another story. And you could get all of this really cool information on individuals who worked on, the Hill here in DC, or, the judicial branch, or, executive branch, and where they worked and where they were lobbyists and all of that. It's a fascinating, fascinating project, but there were a couple limitations with it. The first one is we built it in SQL, and the disambiguation aspects of it were just extraordinarily difficult. And in order to run them, it became very, very difficult. And the biggest thing we got from customer feedback coming out of the gate with the product was they wanted more data. They wanted different data. And integrating different data sources into a product like that really took a rework of the full data model, and it was really, really difficult to do. And the other one we learned about is data accuracy. The process of pulling 20 years of data in OCR then was good, but there was also other aspects of the data that we had less control over. For example, the lobbying data that you get from the federal government has basically human filled out forms. So, Pete and Peter and, Bob and Robert, all, they may be the same people, but they're all, being written slightly different. Who's ever typing in the information, calls people differently. So that made that challenge of disambiguation, specifically within SQL, really, really difficult, but it also made the data accuracy on the other side really, really difficult. And so when you're trying to recreate this sort of, as I like to say, this Rolodex of individuals here in Washington, D.C., some people know it better than others. And so if that data is not fully accurate, people will dismiss it immediately. So those were like the two big lessons learned I got from that. Then from there, I worked in another part of Sage and built out some data platforms and really sort of got into like platform work. But one of the former clients of this product that I sold came to me and said, hey, look, we are a public affairs firm, but we want to recreate that. And I said, great. And so I worked with them to really hone in on exactly what it is they wanted to create, and what they were looking to create is what we now know as an expert finder. So I really worked with them to hone out what are the data sources, what's the value here, where it's going. And then instead of building it in SQL, I went directly to graph. And this was a huge step forward. We built out a proof of concept. We were able to integrate different sources. We had a lot of sources, rudimentary sources, Excel spreadsheets, Access databases. We had some other API access as well too. But then we pulled in the lobbying data as well. We pulled in campaign data and all that. And it was so much easier just to add the information to it, to be able to update the model as we go, to be able to figure out to do the entity resolution within the graph. And it really just opened my eyes up to the possibility of that. One of the challenges we had in this was that fact that, I think we gravitated towards the data solution, which was great, and the technology was interesting, and it was really allowing these things to happen. But we lost focus a little bit on the business side, and this is where I am now really focused on. In coming out of that, is that we temporarily took our eye off that business ball. What was the business value? What services were we really offering the business, and what value were we offering the business? So we spent a lot of time after we built the main components of this expert finder, working with the business to really figure out exactly what the business value was, what were they looking to do, and how we did it. And there's a lot of lessons that come out of that in working with the individuals there to really figure that out. And the biggest thing was, these projects, specifically in the graph world, need to be driven by the business and business challenges, business problems, really focusing on making sure that the platform, whatever we're developing, focuses in on that. And it's really difficult to sort of go back a little bit and try to figure out. Now, luckily, I was in this situation which I was able to do that, but a lot of projects aren't. And so I was able to work with the stakeholders and reformulate sort of the business challenge and the business challenge, the opportunity there for the product, and really work with them to really define exactly what they were looking for, and really help them figure out that what they were really looking for was a business development tool. They wanted to be able to understand who the people who they have worked with in the past, how do they know them now, how could they know them in the future, and how, if they're sitting across them from a table at a meeting, what do they need to know about? Because some of the data we collected, actually a lot of it, we didn't need it anymore. So it really allowed us to pare down the data and really focus in on exactly what was needed to drive those business outcomes that they were looking for. And it taught me a lot about how to do that and how to really work with the stakeholders to be able to pull this information out of them, but then be able to apply it back to the data team, the data engineering, and the data science that we were doing within the graph database that we were building. And then, that was running the Expert Finder application on top of it. And it was, some of the things that really came out of that was that visuals in a product of being able to show networks are fascinating, but people don't really use them. And so a lot of focus on that was more about the users were far more interested in the data, far more interested in the disparate sources of data coming together into one source than being able to see this cool interactive visual. That idea of how you browse that type of information just wasn't important to them. Now, for demos, for presentations, the visuals were fantastic and very, very effective. But for actual usage, people didn't use it. We found this out in the product I worked with, the CQ Press, as well too. Very, very cool, but people just didn't use it. And the other thing we learned specifically from the public affairs firm was the ability to model out business relationships was something that was fascinating to stakeholders. And so that was something too, is that it's taken more from our perspective of more of a data perspective, was interesting. And that's something that we thought, that, we would be able to work with and get the questions, but actually bringing the stakeholders into those conversations about how those relationships are created between different business entities or entities within there and how they're labeled and all of that, really helped them understand what was going on in the graph and what we were trying to achieve. And it was really, really important to bring them into the data modeling expertise to really get that business level of understanding to them as well too. And in general, it's really about starting. The biggest lesson learned from that one was it's really about starting from the business challenge. And this is what I've sort of taken on to PredictiveUX and sort of how I work with the individuals that I work with and the clients that I work with here, is that it's really focused on making sure the upfront work is really, really delve into, right? The discovery phase takes a lot of time and energy. And you really have to really focus in on what is the business challenge, what is the business problem, and then make an honest determination. Is graph or is a knowledge graph really the end solution that you're looking for? It may not be. We've had individuals come to us and say, hey, look, this is the problem that I have. And I said, well, actually, if you do it over here, that's probably better for you. And so it's really about, we get a lot of individuals who come to us and say, hey, look, I want a knowledge graph, or I want this. And the first question we ask is why? Like, why are you coming to us with a solution? Let's talk about the problem, and let's really focus in on what the business challenge is for us. And that's what I focus on now and really working with clients on. So I'll just take a brief pause here before I sort of get into some sort of general lessons learned and some of the challenge I think facing knowledge graphs as well and graph projects. Does anybody have any questions, thoughts, feedback at this point?
Yeah, Greg's got his hand up.
Yeah, hi, Steve. This is really great. I mean, I can really resonate with what you're saying about the difference between the technology and then the business development need. And when you sort of put your pin on the business development need of the business user, mm-hmm. Can you distinguish that need from what you would get from, say, LinkedIn? Right? If it's just like a business network and having access to that network and seeing what people are doing, to what extent is LinkedIn not enough and there's something more that they're looking for? Or is it the same thing, I guess?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's fascinating too, because there's a slight side story to LinkedIn and how I was working with the public affairs firm that I'll touch on at the end here. But it was the historical data that the company had and the public affairs firm had. So, for example, in the public affairs realm, you have a large network of people who can, in this case, can write letters, to congressmen, who can write op-eds, who can, speak on specific topics. And so there are also multiple groups within the public affairs firm, right? There was a media group, there was a research group, there was a client services group. And, depending upon what topic or what issue was in front of the client services team, there were people who have worked, that, were friends of the public affairs firm that, worked, did work on behalf for the media group, but also maybe for the client services team, but also maybe also for the research team too. So pulling in that information gave people a full understanding of the people and the individuals who the company worked with, how they worked with them, and in really also, breaking down sort of the topics of what they worked on, the issues they worked on, what type of things were they good at, the letter writing, the op-eds, all of that. So you couldn't really get that from LinkedIn. You could walk into a meeting and say, oh, this is, Bob Smith, who sits across the table and he works at X firm. But if you knew that, hey, look, someone 3 doors down in my office had that person write an op-ed 3 months ago for this specific client that we had, that's a much different story to tell than just, oh, this is Bob Smith from LinkedIn. And so that was the real value. It's pulling together all that information to give that full story of that information. And a slight side story here for LinkedIn is we actually, one of the cool things we could do is we could pull people's LinkedIn connections and put them into our database and start to create that. And we asked the public affairs firm, like, hey, look, like, we want this information. Do you want to give it to us? And only a couple of people did. Everybody else was very, very, very protective of that information because they didn't want, what they considered to be their Rolodex in the product, which I also thought was also fascinating. And it gets at sort of that idea of knowledge graphs and trying to recreate business. But there's only so far you can actually take that, because in a knowledge-intensive business, there's a specific amount of information in individuals' heads that they just don't want to let go of. And so, it's how do you work around that to get enough information to create value, with that historical data, and not so much then, really feel that the individual may be threatened by taking that information and, allowing other people to see it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you.
And Mark Horton.
Yeah, just a quick one. Hi, Steve. Sorry, I didn't recognize you, but yeah, we had a chat the other day.
Yeah, we did.
So you said something about people didn't like the graph visualization of all of the connected pieces of the graphs. They're just after the data. Can you just talk to that a little bit more? Because that's very much my experience. And if you'd like to come and tell our UX people that that's the case, that would be really very grateful. They don't believe me.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, there's been a couple of things that we can speak of in sort of the 2 products. One, the first product I was working with CQ Press is, when you're ideating and you're working with focus groups and you're working with individuals and you're trying to explain, the actual product, right? Showing a random data sheet of a profile is uninteresting to them, but showing them a connected network is something I think that people are like, oh, this is really neat. I can see the value in that. However, actually, I shouldn't say however, and that works great for, proposals, for, funding, all of these things. People see it, they understand it.
Yeah, it looks cool, and they like to they want it. Yeah, so it's
they
worth
want
it for that.
This is
they
great.
Never use it afterwards. Yeah.
Right, and then you develop it, and the first thing they want to know is whatever, they type in their own name. And they look through the information, right? And you realize very quickly that people are looking for specific information, specific aspects of whether it be a person or a topic, or a work history. And they're honing in on specific pieces of information. They're not going out and looking at this visual to figure out where that person worked. And so there is this massive disconnect between what's cool and what's interesting, to whether it be a focus group, to surveys, versus what actual people are using the information for is completely different. And you get those. There's also this idea, though, of people browsing that, the visual. It's a much different experience than I think people think it is, and it's not really. It doesn't really capture that. People just can go off into corners and then get bored and go on to do something else. So we found both in the product I developed for CQ Press. I had a very painful discussion with the executives when they were like, well, how do you want to improve the product? And the first thing they wanted to do was to build the visual more. And I was like, no, actually, we need more data. We need data here, here, here. And so that was a very difficult conversation, negotiation. And the same thing happened with the public affairs firm. right? They asked me, where do we want to put our priorities? And I was like, in the data. It's got to be data. We got to get cleaner data. We got to better data. We got to get, they're looking for these specific data sources to give a more rounded profile of these individuals. But the stakeholders and the executives making the funding decisions, they wanted to do more visuals because it looked cool. And when they showed it to people outside of the company, they were like, oh, this is really neat, really interesting. So that's what they thought was the most effective. So it's very, very interesting on that front.
Yeah, I call it the automatic gearbox idea, that you don't really care how your automatic gearbox works. As long as you put it in D and you go forwards, then we're all good. That's right. You can show all of the kind of inner workings of how clever it is. And that's where people go, oh, ooh. But then when they come to really using it, they never use it. Yeah, okay, thank you for that. That's confirming all my worst suspicions. Yeah.
And they make great LinkedIn posts, and they make a whole great other stuff, but in general, people are really concerned more about the data that's there.
Another hand from Ahmed. And you're on mute if you're talking.
I was on mute. There we are. It's a very interesting topic. So my question was, is your process of creating graphs, is it, as I'm looking at PUCs and the solutions that you have, is it independent of data? So for the application that comes to mind for me is creating graphs across an AI to between the input and the predictions or the inferences, or if we are talking about generative AI, the generation that the AI does, and being able to do cross-linking of that metadata. Is that something that you guys are looking at, or is that something that you've worked with, or I would love to know that.
So we have not specifically worked on that, and I think the initial the first part of the question, right, was about sort of the data coming in and the sort of the way that we approach it. And we spend a lot of time with our clients and really dig into what data they have, where do they see it, what's their vision for this data and how to use it. And we really come in a lot of different directions out of that. Right? There's no really like one, like, oh, this is a knowledge graph. It's like, well, no, this is, you can just use graph here. We, can put in this here. So for us, it's all dependent on a case-by-case basis, and we haven't gone specifically to that case. A lot of the challenges we deal with are people who are newer to graph or have come into a situation where they're starting to see that, oh, these are new, we can link these together and this would be something interesting we can do, or have a project that's dying on the vine. And so, they're not at that point in the maturity where they're looking at these sort of the higher end sort of use cases at this point. Does that answer the question?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. That definitely touches it. I would love to explore, out of this, out of band, what the capability is, because I can see some applications in some of the things that we're working on, and it would be interesting to explore collaboration.
No, that would be fantastic, and obviously we can set up a time to chat after this. I'd love that. Any other questions before just sort of move on to just some general lessons learned?
Yeah, hi. One of the problems I've seen with visualizing RDF graphs is that they're simply too granular to be useful.
Yeah.
One of the there are other graph products out there that do a superb GUI for navigating graphs. And the best one I found so
Check
far.
your email right now.
Yeah.
Gmail
best-
right now.
The best one I've seen so far is TypeDB, but there are others. That being said, I've kind of
She can pay today.
hello.
Sorry.
One of the conceptual designs that I've come up with is that the default presentation for navigating an RDF graph should be showing shapes and their relationships to other shapes. And then you would be able to explode a shape and to see the little subgraph that it represents. In addition, properties should not be shown in the graph. They should be shown on a mouse over the nodes that they represent. So with some GUI changes, navigating RDF graphs could be very pleasurable, very insightful, and very useful. But the default graph of just showing every single node is pretty much useless, and we need to take things up to the next level, because other people have shown the ways to use these tools, and unfortunately, as far as I can see, the RDF tools out there just aren't there.
I would agree with that, and I also think too. I think is that there's a separation, right, from the graph expertise. There's sort of this administration type look or management type look of the graph that I want to do, and that's where these visuals and the one that you explained there with the shapes would be fascinating, right? But I'm the one using that. I'm the sort of the product manager or the graph expert or the taxonomist or the ontologist, whoever it is, right? These are the people who are managing the graph and the RDF and everything else behind it, right? Those are the experts, right? And it's that management administration type of level of information and like looking into the graph where I think that those tools may start to migrate to. But when you're talking about sort of maybe be the end user or even just, the analysts and things like that, the value decreases dramatically. And so it's something I think that just needs to continue as it goes forward, needs to continue to develop, but really find where that visual use case is really most effective and drive out from there.
That's it for hands up if you want to keep on.
Excellent. So just to quickly go through here a few lessons learned in not only some of the work that I've done in the past, but some of my consulting work as well too that we've worked on through PredictiveUX. And this is just a lot of what I focus on isn't the technology, because I find that there's a lot of really cool, really good technical solutions to these problems. It's really marrying up the technology with the problem. But I think there's a lot of misguided problem statements, a lot of misguided use cases. And so that's sort of where, I focus sort of the lessons learned is really being able to define and understand the use cases, where to focus, and not so much on the technical side of things as well too. So I just sort of want to put that out there. So for me, the lessons I've learned is really being able to solve a specific problem. A lot of the questions that we get focus on very broad questions, but what we're looking for more is, in order to sort of get a graph project up and going, is what is the specific problem or business challenge you're really trying to answer, right? If it's supply chain, it's questions like what happens if this supplier runs out or doesn't have this specific product? Do we have secondary aspect? Do we have a secondary producer? What happens over here? Those types of questions, like what is the specific risk? What's the specific business problem that you're looking to solve? And really being able to hone in on that, because that then leads then to specifically finding the data that you may need to actually build the solution. And then that will then actually lead into then the solution as well too. And really, the other, big lesson really is graph projects are really tie in a lot of information from a lot of different sources. So buy-in is crucial. You really need to make sure that you have stakeholder buy-in, that you get buy-in from other groups, that you may be using the data. If you're going to need to work with HR and get HR data, you're going to need to get their buy-in to get this information and this data from them. And then, also provide the business value. What specifically, and be very upfront about the business value for the graph projects. Like, what is the business value? You have to define it. You have to make sure that you're measuring it as you go, so that when you get the question, oh, hey, look, you're spending a lot of money here on these different resources, and we're spending on this software. What's the specific business value? It could be decreasing risk. It could be increasing opportunity. It could be increasing revenue. But there has to be a business value behind the problem that you're solving. And I also learned that UX research in particular is really helpful in not only getting buy-in, but also really defining the problem that you're trying to solve. And user-driven use cases, personas and journey maps, sometimes fall outside of obviously the data team and the engineering teams and all that. But they need to be brought into those conversations so that, as the solution's being built and the problems are being solved, that those user-driven use cases and the personas always tie back to the end user. Now from a B2B perspective, that could be an analyst, or it could be someone internal. It could be a consumer. It could be a non-consumer. A non-person too. It could be another computer. But those all need to be pulled together so that it's really focused on what the end result is going to be, and that should tie back to business value, which should tie back to the specific problem. The last couple here sort of get into how to get the buy-in. Really a lot of communication. One challenge I've seen from a data perspective, and this is what I ran into when I worked for the public affairs firm, was that a challenge or a solution comes to a data team, and then off we go and we solve it, or so we think. And we were losing that communication with the business, with the users and others. And that's something that's crucial as you get these projects up and going. Being able to show the project at any time is good. And this is sort of where the visuals are both good and bad, right? So from, as you're getting the project off the ground, it's really important to show people what can be done and sort of where you're going, and really showing that front. So those are just some of sort of the lessons I've learned for really getting a graph project off the ground, and really getting the full buy-in needed for them to be successful, and so that hopefully they don't die on the vine after a few months of specifically a lot of hard work and effort being put in by the data team or the engineering team to really build these solutions out. Any thoughts, questions, feedback? All right.
Currently.
All right.
Oh, there we go. Andrew.
Yes, Stephen, do you find that there is any kind of affinity for certain user experiences by persona, such that if you have a given persona, they prefer a certain user experience? And then on top of that, do you also find, or not, that knowledge graphs their strength and malleability is also kind of a drawback in some ways, because you have too many options in the ways you can visualize the data?
Yes. So let's tackle the first question first, and then I'll get into the second one. But there's a yes to both of those. So with specifically the personas, so I'll give you two specific personas I had at the public affairs firm that I work for. The first one was we had a media group, and they wanted to get in and use the expert finder to find people in media. So they were very, very specific of the information they wanted to see. And of course, that was then, but in general, the groups were, that's in general, like the groups were looking for specific things in there. So a lot of it was about that data presentation on the page. However, in different products I've worked on, I've had, areas where we specifically had librarians going in, and their persona for what they were looking for was much different than the students who were going in and looking at the information and what they were trying to get out of. So yes, there are definitely different personas and sort of what information they're looking for. And it sort of comes as a product, management challenge, right? About which to focus on, which is the highest value, and working with and really talking to the users on that. We also had, with the public affairs firm, we had non-persona users, right? We had other APIs, we had other that we were connecting to and pushing data out to. So we had vendors who were connecting to as well that we'd push information out to. So that was simply different too. So we had to account for that as well too. So, yeah, there are a lot of different personas, and there are a lot of different ways in which the information needs to be presented, depending upon the overall use case. For example, in the public affairs realm, it was very much of a research tool, but in other realms, it could be something completely different. So yeah, it's persona is very key in making sure that you're not overdoing it with 500 different personas, because this gets into the second part of the question, is that one of the challenges with knowledge graphs is there's a lot of things you can do with it. And there's a lot of ways to express the data. There's a lot of ways to visualize the data, and it gets overwhelming. And I feel at times, sometimes you're sort of shooting in the dark to try to figure out, what that great use case may be for the project. And I think that is also a challenge too. And it's really about honing in on the specific use cases and getting back to, the previous slide about being able to say, okay, this is the use case, this is the business value, this is, the business challenge we're trying to overcome, and really staying steadfastly focused on those, and being able to show that the investments being made are basically in alignment with the solutions and the challenges being achieved.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome. So with graph projects and knowledge graph projects, I wrote an article a couple months ago about how knowledge graphs are entering the trough of disillusionment as laid out by Gartner, and I it really resonated with me because when I read that, because it was something that I see a lot in organizations, as they build the graph database, or they, like we talked about, they solve the specific challenge and all of that, there comes a point where they take a look at the knowledge graph or the graph database and basically try to figure out sort of what's next. And there's a little bit of disillusionment, I think, in the knowledge graph world right now, because there's a lot of big challenges that need to be overcome. And the first big challenge, I think, is just expertise. There's a lack of expertise in organizations to be able to manage and handle and develop knowledge graphs and graph databases. And it's something that I think scares a lot of people away from implementing these solutions. The other one is dedicated resources. Once you build something, you're going to have to dedicate the resources to actually maintain it, operate it, and to really continue to drive that forward. And licensing and all of that, those resources, could be quite extensive. So if you start with a small project, you have to really work with the stakeholders and the business to really understand what the eventual cost may be as well too. Also, behavioral change. Work with one company in which they took information from one system, exported it into Excel, took information from another system, exported it into Excel, and basically they had multiple people just pull that information together into one Excel spreadsheet, and create this massive, just growing spreadsheet. But that's how they got to where they needed to go with that analysis of taking the information. It's really difficult to recreate those processes that have taken years, or embedded in how people do their work, and put them into a knowledge platform. So that behavioral change is a really big challenge, and it takes a lot to get over. And it's not something that you're going to be able to take a knowledge graph, you implement it, and everyone's going to be like, oh yeah, I'll just do it over here. A lot of hand holding is going to need to take place, and that gets back to sort of the resource and the dedication needed to do that, to make those transformations happen. There's also tribal decision making in organizations. One person's great piece of data is, used one way, another person uses it differently. And so in order for a knowledge graph solution or a graph solution to be effective in presenting information, it has to be able to, account for, the different ways that people are using this data. And, it's really quite challenging to make sure you get them all, and to really make sure that you understand all of those different use cases. The next one is data access. We brought up this briefly before, but if you're going to work with HR data, you need to have access to the HR systems. If you're going to pull in sales data, you need to have sales data access. In large organizations, they're extraordinarily complex and it's really difficult. So you almost become, the term I like to throw around is data wrangler, but it's more than that. It's really getting in and having experts understand the different data systems and be able to pull it all together. And I know there's a lot of work being done on sort of the data mesh and ideas and the culture of sort of decentralization and all that. But a lot of organizations aren't nearly mature enough to get to that point. And so there's a lot of, like meetings in which there's individuals who say, I know we have this piece of data somewhere, right? Or it's here, or no, it's in this report. So let's go and get that. But actually facilitating that in a large organization is extraordinarily complex. And the last one is scaling. Right, in the getting a graph project off the ground, you're usually very focused, but scaling that beyond becomes, a lot of the challenges right above it all sort of come into play with that as well too. Not only do you have resource costs, and you've got data access, you've got expertise. It's all sort of scaling a solution is from a knowledge graph perspective is very, very cost intensive. And so, in order to sort of bridge that gap, for me, it's really coming back and making sure that you're not getting ahead of yourself and you're really focusing on what the knowledge graph can do, what the users are looking for, what the consumer, the data consumer, whether it's human or non-human, is trying to do, and really trying to really understand that. So you're continuing to iterate on the value on that front. And I think that's, the best way to go about overcoming these challenges and constantly proving the value so that you can get more resources, so that you can work on the behavioral change, and so that you can break down those decision-making processes, sort of one by one. But it's whole part of a larger digital transformation, which takes a very long time to do. And, simply building a knowledge graph or a graph application or a graph database isn't going to solve those. It's going to take many, many years in a lot of organizations to get the really where you want to go with these types of digital transformation aspects. And I think knowledge graph firmly fits within that realm.
Got 3
Thoughts,
hands.
questions?
Greg.
Yeah. So I'm really interested in sort of universal data models, taking something like Excel and make it able to be coexistent with a graph, for instance, right? So your RDF, your LPG, and your Excel are all in the same place. But I think it's really interesting that the sort of practical issues you're raising here is that people they're used to working in Excel, right? And so when they find the Excel data they're looking for, they don't really want to be in their graph solution anymore. They just want to go back to Excel. And so you have this question of where do you scope the graph technology in terms of its reach? Is it search purely? Is it like, data finding, data wrangling? So I'm really curious your thoughts on, is there a best place? And there's no one answer for this, obviously, but generally speaking, should graph have a perimeter as a technology where it really doesn't try to go beyond? It doesn't try to become a database. It tries to just simply find things in databases like data mesh, right? Or as a research tool, it's going to be your go-to hub for organizing all your information, but it's not going to actually hold that information. You're going to have to go then and link out to it. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on like what users want in terms of the applications they want to be using and how you could work a graph solution into their workflow then, practically speaking.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. And I think there's a lot of time and effort, being spent on trying to find like where that line is. And for me, I have found success with graph being sort of the data hub, taking the information, making it findable, making it searchable, pulling that information together. And then I also find, though, there are specific sort of applications on top of that, which I think are very, very interesting, but they all sort of fall back in sort of the search and the findability realm of, for example, with the expert finder, it's all right, we've pulled all this information together. We've given you everything. Now, what do you want to do with this profile? What do you want to do? Oh, you want to create these. So it's building the applications off of that sort of that what the end user is now happy with and the information that they have and going forward with that. But those aren't graph solutions, right? Those are application development, that's UI development. And so it's taking it in that level and not so much putting it back on the graph to do. The other thing I found very powerful with graph, and this is something that's becoming a little bit more prevalent, but being able to, monitor like graph analytics, and being able to also fix information as well too, I also find really, really interesting, and that's a graph solution, right? Being able to, like for example, with my expert finder, and this is not something that we developed at the time, but being able to fix information that's there and put that information back in. So building the knowledge base as well too. And so that's sort of where at this point, I think from a graph perspective, as to sort of where we're at regarding sort of where that line is, I do think it kind of fits within that sort of that search, the findability, and sort of working with data realm. And it will eventually, but it's not quite yet gone much further than that.
Tim.
Hi, Tim Smith. I'm with Procter & Gamble, and we've been working with graphs for 20 plus years. And one of the things that I find interesting is that users respond to different visualization techniques. And one of my colleagues used to take her notes on paper as a graph for every meeting, and it was phenomenal. And then I have other people that you show them a graph and they just recoil. They just do not understand, this is
Right.
connected to that, so on. So what is your experience kind of using shapes as projections of the graph into different visualization paradigms? So going back to the different stakeholders in a project and users being one of the stakeholders, of using shapes to extract a portion of the graph and then visualize that shape as maybe a table or some other pre-formatted wiki page, or as a or maybe there is a piece of the graph that's relevant. Speaking to the comment earlier about showing kind of the high level concepts and then being able to drill them, and have you found that to be an effective way to keep the graph at the core so everything remains connected, but yet supporting multiple interaction use cases?
Yes, and I will say yes emphatically. I found specifically with the expert finder is that we had the basic visual where you could type in someone's name and you could click on the dot, the node, and expand it and explore. But then what the user didn't understand was that on that profile page we had graph-driven data consistently. In particular, when you looked at sort of the topics of the person or the issues that this person was related to, all of that was all driven off the graph, right? This is the issues they're related to. If you want to find other people who are related to this issue, and it was coming up in what we would consider basic web forms, right? Tables, different visuals for very simple, web browsing. And the answer to that is it's really about the data and how they want to access it, and working with them to really figure out exactly how to do that without, getting away from the sort of being driven fully by graph. There's a lot of different ways that you can pull that data in and make it accessible to them. There was one table I remember developing that had multiple pieces from different graph database. Multiple pieces from different disparate data sources on there that were pulled together and that were related within the graph. But when you were reading it, you wouldn't know that. It just looked like a table, and it looked like, oh, this person did this. This is when they did it, and this is how they know this person over here who is related in that article or whatever they wrote, right? And so the answer to that is yes. It's not just all about specifically the infamous graph visual with the nodes.
Great, thank you.
Steve Case.
Yeah, Steve, I can completely empathize with the ongoing challenges. I'm on the business development side at Semantic Arts, so see these barriers often. And so I was just wanting to ask you the question more around, certainly you presented some scenarios that would cause me to kind of run the other way as quickly as possible with all these things coming together, because you're never going to get that scenario where there's going to be agreement on all this. But is there certain ones that hover to the top that would be ones that you say, okay, we have this. Now we can start a little bit of a graph experiment and move forward, because behavioral change that may come. Maybe they don't have the internal expertise, but if you don't have data access and like you said, understanding of those business requirements and what those are, then you're at a stalemate getting out of the gate. So I was curious as to your experiences as to what you found that is sufficient enough to start a graph experiment.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Steve. And so we've found a lot of success with clients who have control or a source of data that they feel would be like, there's something here, like we can link it to this source, and we've got control over this because this is our first party data here, and we have this. Those are really the ones in which I think those are the ones that sort of perk my ears up, because if you're working with the individuals or the team that has access to 3 or 4 different disparate data sources, which they're maybe already working with, maybe they have another solution, maybe they're driving a different analytics product off of it or things like that, and you can work directly with them and be able to create sort of that proof of concept with that data that they already have access to. That's really where we see the greatest traction from a standpoint of people really buying into that solution. But it's mainly because they have access to this data and they think that there's something there if they can link it together, and they could use graph and we can make it all happen and work with them to really drive out those use cases. Those are the ones that we find the most success with.
Thank you.
Good. Michael Sullivan.
Yeah, I'm working on a very interesting project that's a classic semantic graph, and RDF fits it to a T. But both the consumers and the producers of the content are third parties, and none of them have any expertise or interest in Sparkle. So the entire interfaces will be things like CSV or GraphQL or JSON, not JSON LD, and so basically all they will see, either as a contributor of content, and they can upload a CSV, or they can create a REST solution or whatever. For their developers, this is very straightforward. We'll publish the JSON schemas and the GraphQL schemas and the CSV schemas, and they'll be able to read and write to them, and that's what they'll see. And yet, on terms of managing and enriching the data and doing analysis, that'll be all done with classic graph behind the scenes. So, we're seeing this emphasis on linked open data sometimes misses a key point, which is most people don't want to deal with graph, but they want the benefits of it. And so this kind of pattern where the interfaces that people see are spreadsheets basically, or JSON trees or whatever. It's like, okay, fine, we can do that for you. And how to automate all this is another problem altogether. But we're working on that. It's a very, very interesting project.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see more of those when you're looking sort of in the custom graph development world. That's you're going to see more of that, and getting away from sort of whether it be a web-based interface or mobile interface of these visuals. It's going to be much more of there's the graph. here's the information it produces. How do you want it? Like, how do you want to interact with it in working with them on that front?
Cool. And back to Andrew.
Yeah, I'm glad Steve was before me. My question is, do you see a future where, given that there's kind of user experience patterns that are tied to personas, do you see a future where there's a UX equivalent to something like GIST, where you see these patterns emerge and you create these buildable blocks that you could tie into something like an upper ontology, which leads to something like a low code or no code future, at least that is domain specific? Have you thought about those types of things? Is that out of the question?
I haven't given much thought to it, but you know, from what I gather, the answer I think to that is yes. I think as we continue to see these patterns emerge, I think they will be able to be wrapped up in sort of a low code ontology, and being able to sort of put the blocks in place to at least start off at a slightly further level based on the domain that you're entering, so that, you know, the domain knowledge, you know, may be able to build out like, oh, we put this piece here, and then we're here. And I definitely think that's you're going to start to see that in the future.
Very good. We're right on the half-hour mark here. Any last thoughts from anybody? All right. Well, thanks, Steve, for coming and sharing with us. I'll get the recording from today posted up and emailed out to everybody here a little bit later on, if anyone wants to review. And Steve, hopefully you'll join us again.
That'd be great. Excellent. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. All great questions, and it's really good to get to know everybody a little bit.
Thanks. Appreciate it all.
Great. Thanks a lot.